September 5, 1944, 11:30 a.m. Ziegenberg, Germany. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt stepped back into Oberbefehlshaber West headquarters after 2 months away, and before anyone spoke, he already knew. Something was wrong. The building was quiet, not the focused silence of a functioning command post, but the hollow stillness of a place where decisions no longer mattered. This did not feel like headquarters. It felt like a mausoleum. In July, Hitler had fired Rundstedt for committing the one unforgivable crime in the Third Reich, telling the truth. He had said Normandy was lost, that France was bleeding out, that Germany should seek peace while there was still something left to bargain with. Now the Führer had called him back. Dictators do not recall dismissed commanders for reassurance. They recall them when the system is failing and there is no one left to blame. General Günther Blumentritt waited beside a long table covered in maps. And those maps were more honest than any report. The lines did not show an organized withdrawal or a controlled defense. They showed collapse. The ink might as well have been blood. 6 weeks earlier, the Allies had finally broken out of Normandy. Now they were racing across France at a speed that felt unreal even to the men watching it happen. Most of France was already gone. American and British forces were surging toward Germany's frontier with a momentum that belonged in nightmares, not military textbooks. Blumentritt traced a finger across the map, down to the southern sector, and stopped on the spearhead that mattered most, Lieutenant General George S. Patton's Third Army. In just 3 weeks, Patton had torn across hundreds of kilometers of French countryside. His forward elements now sat barely 150 kilometers from the German border, with nothing solid between them and the Rhine. Rundstedt stared at the empty space on the map the way a man stares at an open door in a burning house. The room stayed silent. Then he asked the question he already knew the answer to, because the map had already given it. What do we have to stop him? Blumentritt didn't soften it. His voice was flat, professional, empty of hope. Nothing. The German situation in the first days of September 1944 was worse than most people can easily picture, worse than the clean arrows and symbols on classroom maps. This was not an orderly withdrawal to prepared positions. This was not a defensive plan unfolding with grim efficiency. This was the near-total disintegration of German military power in Western Europe, the kind of failure that cracks an officer corps from the inside because it violates everything that corps believes about itself. Rundstedt and Blumentritt were looking at a front where the units that had fought in France were dead, scattered, or fleeing east in disorder. Heavy equipment had been abandoned in fields and ditches. Vehicles were blown by their own crews because fuel was gone, and immobilized armor was worse than useless. It was an advertisement of weakness. Columns that had once moved under tight control now moved like a tide of panic, each man thinking only about getting across the Rhine before the Americans reached it. For an officer class raised on the myth of German order and tactical superiority, the humiliation cut deeper than defeat. This was the nightmare. Not simply being beaten, but being unmade. Then the map revealed something worse. After the war, German commanders were unusually candid about just how weak they had been in those early September days. American Army historians questioned them at length, and the testimony that survived is striking not for excuses, but blunt detail that bordered on confession. General Siegfried Westwall, who served as Chief of Operations at OB West, later estimated that around the first days of September, the entire Western Front possessed the effective combat strength of perhaps 10 to 12 divisions. To someone who doesn't live inside military numbers, that might sound like a formidable force. The number was a mirage. A German division on paper was supposed to field around 17,000 men with full artillery, anti-tank capability, and logistical support. These were not paper divisions. Most were battered remnants, 2,000 to 5,000 men, sometimes less. Short of ammunition, short of fuel, short of heavy weapons. Many lacked reliable artillery. Many were missing transport. Some had lost their command structures entirely and were held together by nothing more than the authority of a single surviving officer and shared instinct to survive. Against them, Patton alone commanded roughly a dozen divisions, many near full strength, well supplied compared to the enemy, and backed by complete Allied air superiority. The P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs owned the sky. Anything that moved on German roads during daylight hours was a target. Even if Germany's Western divisions had been healthy and positioned perfectly, they would have been outmatched. They were not healthy. They were not positioned perfectly. They were barely positioned at all. But then, what happened next shocked everyone. The most critical weakness was reserves. In military terms, reserves are what keep a front from snapping. They are what you commit to seal a breach, to stop a breakthrough, to restore a line after a shock. They are the margin between bending and breaking. In early September 1944, Germany effectively had no meaningful reserves in the West. Blumentritt later stated with uncomfortable precision that there were no panzer divisions available for immediate deployment anywhere between the English Channel and the Swiss border. The armored units that had fought in Normandy had been destroyed or were being rebuilt far back inside Germany, in training areas where they could not be touched by Allied bombers. The few formations still technically assigned to the West were shadows, 20% strength, still forming, not ready. And without armored reserves, stopping an armored thrust becomes almost impossible. Infantry can dig in, infantry can delay, but infantry cannot reliably hunt down fast-moving tank columns, cannot cut them apart, cannot deliver the kind of counterpunch that ends a breakthrough before it becomes a catastrophe. To stop Patton's kind of warfare, aggressive reconnaissance, rapid exploitation, deep penetration, you needed panzers. There were none. Westwall and others like him were later uncomfortably direct about the conclusion that followed. Germany had no reserves, no properly manned fortifications, and no prepared positions in depth. If Patton had been able to keep his tempo in those early September days, they believed he could have reached the Rhine quickly and possibly crossed it, because there was no coherent defensive system capable of absorbing that shock. The door was open, the corridor was clear, the enemy was running. Then, everything went wrong. German intelligence, even in chaos, remained sharp at one thing: tracking Allied movement. They knew where Patton was. They watched the radio traffic. They saw the speed of his spearheads, the direction of his pushes, the pattern of his reconnaissance raids. Frontline observers reported American tank columns moving with the kind of confidence that comes from knowing the enemy has nothing left to throw at you. They also knew something else. Patton's fuel situation was tightening. Supply lines stretched across hundreds of kilometers of French roads. Priority was being shifted north to support Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's Operation Market Garden. The logistical pipeline that had fed the pursuit was beginning to choke. That knowledge was a thin thread to hold on to, but in desperation, you cling to thin things. Then something happened that German command could not understand. At first, Patton's advance slowed. Then it faltered. Then it almost stopped. The Third Army that had been covering 30 to 40 miles a day was suddenly sitting by roadsides or inching forward in short, cautious movements. German intelligence officers monitoring American radio traffic reported severe fuel shortages. Tanks were immobilized, combat operations were being curtailed, units were consolidating positions instead of racing into the open space ahead. At the beginning, some German officers suspected deception. Patton was aggressive. Patton was theatrical. Patton was known for misdirection and sudden thrusts. Perhaps the talk of fuel shortages was a trick, a way to lure German forces into premature counterattacks against what appeared to be stationary targets. But as day followed day and the Third Army remained largely stationary, the impossible truth became undeniable. It was not deception. It was logistics. Patton was not being stopped by German resistance, he was being stopped by empty fuel tanks. Inside Rundstedt's headquarters, the relief was not subtle. It moved through the staff like a physical sensation, as if a weight that had been crushing their chests was lifted just enough to allow breathing again. They had no idea what was coming. For the American tankers, that pause must have felt surreal. For weeks, their world was sound and motion, engines roaring, tracks clattering, dust choking the air, the constant adrenaline of a chase in which the enemy seemed to dissolve before them like ghosts in daylight. Then suddenly, the noise fell away. Thousands of men sat beside roads in the late summer sun, staring at maps that showed open country ahead, open routes, empty space where the enemy should have been. They could feel, almost in their bones, that German resistance was broken. The door was open, the corridor was clear, but the fuel gauges were empty. The silence was not peace. It was heavy with the weight of missed opportunity. It was the feeling of a winning ticket slipping from your fingers while everyone around you pretends it has not fallen. Crew commanders stood beside their M4 Shermans and M26 Pershings, knowing that somewhere ahead, maybe 40 kilometers, maybe 60, German officers were scrambling to build something from nothing. Every hour of stillness was an hour the enemy used to recover. Every day of waiting was a day the war would not end. After the war, German commanders described this pause in extraordinary language. They spoke of it the way men speak of a miracle, not a religious miracle, but an event so beneficial and so inexplicable in military terms that it felt like providence. These were not romantic minds. These were professional officers trained to search for rational causes in battlefield chaos. Yet they struggled to find one. Rundstedt later wrote that the halt of Patton's Third Army in early September was inexplicable from a military standpoint. Patton had the strength, the position, the momentum. That he did not reach the Rhine then felt like a gift Germany did not deserve and could not have bought with anything it still possessed. Blumentritt, questioned by American officers after the surrender, was even more direct. When Patton stopped, German commanders could not understand why the Americans had stopped themselves at the moment Germany was most exposed and least able to resist. The phrase that echoes through German post-war recollection is striking, das Wunder im Westen, the miracle in the West, a term that deliberately reminded them of earlier moments in German history when collapse had been unexpectedly delayed. But this time, the miracle was not a new weapon or a brilliant maneuver. It was a pause forced by logistics, not will, and they did not waste it. If you have made it this far, you are the reason channels like ours can keep the past alive. Let me know where you are tuning in from. Drop a like and subscribe so these voices from history continue to be heard. Between the first days of September and the end of November 1944, German command rebuilt their western defenses at a speed that alarmed Allied intelligence watching it unfold in real time. The transformation was not elegant. It was desperate, improvised, held together by the kind of organizational discipline that survives even in defeat. The first priority was the Westwall. Units that had been retreating in disorder were reorganized, re-equipped as best as possible, and sent into the bunkers. Training battalions were rushed forward from the Reich. Luftwaffe ground personnel, mechanics, radar operators, airfield crews were formed into emergency infantry formations. Kriegsmarine sailors who never expected to hold a rifle in a trench were now holding one because there was nothing else. Men who should have been servicing aircraft or loading torpedoes were instead manning machine gun positions in concrete pillboxes, learning on the job how to lay fields of fire, how to register mortar coordinates, how to stay alive long enough to delay the inevitable. By late September, the Westwall shifted from empty concrete to a real defensive position, imperfect, uneven, often manned by exhausted troops who never trained for this kind of warfare, but real enough to slow an attacker and bleed him. The second priority was armor. Germany's tank production in late 1944 remained surprisingly high given the bomb damage and industrial chaos.
Factories continued turning out Panzer IVs, Panthers, and even the fearsome Tiger IIs. But producing tanks and using them effectively are two different problems.
In the first weeks after Normandy, the issue was not only numbers, it was time. Time to move vehicles to the front by rail. Time to gather crews scattered across hospitals and replacement depots. Time to rebuild shattered formations into units that could fight as units again, not just collections of individual tanks. The pause gave Germany that time. By November, several armored divisions that had been mauled in Normandy had been reconstituted to fighting strength and placed where they could be used, either to defend critical sectors or to strike. German record-keeping, even in defeat, remained meticulous, and post-war analysis of orders of battle makes clear how rapidly the West was reinforced. During September and into October, divisions were transferred from wherever they could be found, from the Eastern Front, from occupation duties in Norway and Denmark, from training areas inside Germany, and pushed west. Some were Panzer or Panzer Grenadier divisions with meaningful armor. Many were not elite, but they were intact. Alongside them came newly formed Volksgrenadier divisions, lower-quality formations built from older men, young recruits barely out of training, and recovered wounded returned to duty before their bones had fully healed. They were not designed for grand mobile warfare, but they could man trenches, operate artillery, and hold a bunker long enough to make an attacker pay in blood for every meter of ground. In early September, Germany had almost nothing coherent in the West. By November, they had assembled the equivalent of dozens of divisions, enough to stiffen the Westwall and create something like a reserve. And that time, those weeks, had one consequence larger than all the rest. It made possible the Ardennes Offensive. The operation that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge was not improvised. It required months of planning, stockpiling ammunition in hidden depots, gathering fuel from reserves that should not have existed, assembling armies in forests where Allied reconnaissance could not see them, and building a deception plan strong enough to preserve surprise against an enemy who owned the sky. General Hasso von Montefiore, who commanded 5th Panzer Army in the Ardennes, later testified with brutal honesty that the operation would have been impossible if Patton had continued advancing in September. The troops needed for the attack would have been tied down defending the Rhine approaches in desperate firefights. The fuel and ammunition would have been consumed in defensive battles, trying to hold river crossings and urban strongpoints. The surprise would have been lost because Germany would have been fighting for its life on its own border. But because the front stabilized in September, Hitler's staff had time. They assembled 3 armies, 6th Panzer Army, 5th Panzer Army, and 7th Army, in the Eifel forests. They gathered supplies in quantities that strained what remained of German logistics. They identified a weak seam in the Allied line, the Ardennes sector, lightly defended because Allied intelligence judged the terrain too difficult for major armored operations. When the attack came on December 16, 1944, it achieved complete tactical surprise. German artillery opened fire in darkness and fog. Infantry and armor surged forward against American positions held by inexperienced divisions and exhausted veterans rotating out of heavy combat. The shock was total. Within days, German spearheads had driven a deep bulge into American positions. The human cost was immediate and catastrophic. American units were overrun, surrounded, forced to surrender or fight their way out through snow and forest. The 106th Infantry Division lost 2 entire regiments. The 101st Airborne was besieged at Bastogne. Casualties mounted in numbers that should have belonged to the worst days of Normandy, not December in Belgium. Whether one argues over exact casualty figures or precise timelines, the human cost was unquestionable.
Allied casualties for the Battle of the Bulge exceeded 80,000 men, killed, wounded, missing, or captured. German casualties were similar or higher, but the strategic cost to the Allies was time. Time measured in weeks when the advance towards Germany was not just slowed, but reversed. Men who might have lived if the German army had never had the chance to mount that gamble were buried instead under Ardennes snow. Families received telegrams in January that might never have been sent if fuel trucks had reached Patton in September. When Patton finally received enough fuel and supplies to resume broad offensive action later in September, the war he returned to was not the war he had left. The Germans were no longer a mob streaming east across open country. They were in prepared positions with interlocking fields of fire. Artillery was registered on likely approach routes. Minefields were laid with German precision. The Westwall was manned by men who understood that there was no more retreat. The Rhine was at their backs, and their families were beyond it. The same ground that had offered miles of opportunity in early September now offered yards of suffering in October. Progress that had been measured in dozens of miles was now measured in hundreds of yards won at the cost of blood and steel. Casualties rose, the weather turned. The bright skies of summer gave way to autumn rain and then winter cold. Air support, so decisive in the pursuit across France, became unreliable under clouds and storms. Pilots could not see targets. Ground controllers could not direct strikes. The technological advantage that had made Allied armor almost invulnerable now meant less when the sky was closed. There is a tragic poetry to that shift. During the pursuit across France, the skies were bright. It felt like liberation, like inevitability, like the war rushing towards its ending with the momentum of justice. Then, when the supplies finally arrived and the offensive resumed against hardened defenses, the rains came. Gray skies, mud that swallowed vehicles, cold that froze men in their foxholes. The optimism of August drained away into the mud of autumn. Men who might have ended the war in summer uniforms now shivered in foxholes, fighting for hedgerows and bunker lines that should have been bypassed months before. German officers recognized the difference immediately. Once the Westwall was manned, they believed Patton remained dangerous. His tactical skill had not diminished, his aggressive instinct had not faded, but he was no longer unstoppable. Now they could trade space for time, conduct fighting withdrawals, choose positions, force the Americans to assault prepared lines where German advantages in defensive engineering could offset American advantages in numbers and firepower. In early September, they could not have done any of that. They had been at the edge of collapse, hours or days from complete disintegration, and they had been granted the one gift that matters more than any weapon: time.
Patton ultimately crossed the Rhine on March 22, 1945, more than 6 months after he had been within striking distance of it. By then, the war was entering its final act. German resistance was breaking under overwhelming pressure from west and east. Soviet armies were already deep inside Germany from the opposite direction. The outcome was no longer in doubt. But the opportunities of September were long gone, buried under winter snow and spring mud. Patton knew it. In his later writings and private correspondence, he expressed frustration that the Rhine crossing had been delayed so long, that a moment of decision had been missed. He believed that if his army had reached the river in early autumn, German resistance might have cracked months earlier, that the psychological shock of American armor on German soil, combined with the material reality of total encirclement, might have forced a collapse. German testimony after the surrender echoed that belief with uncomfortable consistency. Westwall, Rundstedt, Blumentritt, Monteuf, and others stated in post-war interrogations and memoirs that in those first days of September, Germany lacked the forces to stop Patton. The Westwall was not properly manned. Reserves did not exist. Morale was shattered. The front was held together by nothing more than inertia and the hope that something, anything, would intervene. American interrogators pressed the point because they wanted to know if continuing would have been operationally feasible. They asked whether Germany could have prevented Patton from reaching the Rhine if the advance had not been starved of fuel. They asked whether a sustained Allied thrust might have ended the war in 1944 instead of 1945. The German answers, across multiple testimonies and sources, aligned with striking clarity. The Western Front was on the verge of psychological and material collapse. A sudden American presence on German soil in early autumn, combined with relentless Soviet pressure from the east, could have produced a crisis that Berlin might not have survived intact. The Ardennes Offensive, in that scenario, would not have existed, not because Germany lacked imagination or will, but because it would have lacked the breathing room to prepare it. The fuel would have been consumed defending the Rhine. The ammunition would have been expended in retreat. The formations would have been destroyed piecemeal, trying to hold river crossings against an enemy who had momentum and time on his side. History is not a machine where you turn one gear and the outcome changes cleanly. Wars are too complex, too dependent on human decisions and random chance to reduce to simple cause and effect. But the German perspective offers something rare, the testimony of the men who would have tried to stop Patton, admitting they could not. They were not saved by superior training or brilliant defensive artistry in those early September days. They were not saved by a brilliant operational maneuver or the arrival of reserves. They were saved by an American pause forced by logistics beyond Patton's control. And they knew exactly what that pause meant. In their post-war writings and teaching at military academies, German professionals emphasized operational tempo as a lesson written in blood. When the enemy is broken and running, you do not grant him the chance to recover. You maintain pressure until his system collapses completely, until the psychological shock becomes irreversible, until surrender feels like relief rather than humiliation. Blumentritt used September 1944 as a case study in defensive recovery, how a defeated force given breathing space can rebuild a line that did not exist the week before. Logistics matter, he argued, in lectures to the next generation of officers, but they cannot be allowed to freeze an army at the moment of decision, because an army that stops gives its enemy the most precious gift available in war: time. Time to think, time to regroup, time to hope. And time in 1944 was bought with lives. The months Germany gained did not change the final outcome. The Third Reich was doomed by its own choices long before September, but those months changed who survived to see the ending. The delay helped make possible the brutal fighting in the Hurtgen forest, where men died by the thousands for ridgelines that meant nothing. It made possible the frozen hell of the Ardennes, where entire divisions were chewed apart in forests and villages whose names most Americans had never heard. It made possible the slow, grinding advance through the Siegfried Line, where every bunker had to be taken by assault, every pillbox reduced by explosives and flamethrowers. The September halt was not simply a strategic mistake on a map, an interesting footnote for military historians to debate. It was a human tragedy measured in empty chairs at kitchen tables, in letters that arrived too late, in families that never received their sons back, in wives who became widows and children who grew up without fathers. That is the weight of those quiet days when Patton's tanks sat by French roadsides with empty fuel gauges, staring into open country that would not stay open long. The crews knew it, the officers knew it, Patton himself knew it, and the frustration burned in him like acid. They could see the door. They were standing in front of it. The corridor beyond was clear. German resistance had dissolved. The Wehrmacht, the machine that had conquered most of Europe, was running in disorder. One more push, one more surge of fuel and ammunition, and they might have been on the Rhine before the leaves fell from the trees. But logistics are not about desire. They are about trucks and railroad cars, about ports and depots, about tonnage calculations and priority decisions made by men hundreds of miles from the front who were juggling demands from multiple armies across multiple fronts.
And the decision was made, consciously or not, to let the pursuit falter while supplies were redirected north. The door closed, not with a slam, but with the quiet grinding of empty fuel pumps and stationary tank columns. And when it opened again, weeks later, German soldiers were waiting on the other side with machine guns and mortars and the desperate courage of men defending their homeland. The miracle in the West was no miracle at all. It was a pause. But that pause changed everything. It turned a pursuit into a siege. It turned August optimism into winter blood. It turned a war that might have ended in autumn into a war that ground on through winter into spring, consuming men in numbers that should haunt anyone who studies those months. Rundstedt stood in his headquarters in September and watched the impossible happen, watched his enemy stop himself when nothing else could have. He did not celebrate. Professional soldiers do not celebrate gifts they do not understand. But he used the time he was given, and the using of it cost lives that might have been spared. That is the legacy of September 1944. Not a story of German brilliance, but a story of opportunity lost and time granted, and the human cost of decisions made far from the sound of guns. The tanks sat silent by French roadsides while German engineers worked through the night to man bunkers that had been empty the week before. And when the war resumed, it was a different war, harder, bloodier, longer. The door was open. For a few brief days in early September, the path to ending the war in 1944 existed not as fantasy, but as operational possibility. German commanders admitted it. American commanders suspected it. The maps showed it. But the fuel trucks never came in time. And that silence, that pause, echoes still in every name on every memorial to the men who died between September and May, fighting battles that might never have needed to be fought. History does not offer second chances. It only offers consequences. And the consequences of that September pause were measured in tens of thousands of lives that ended in snow and mud when they might have ended in celebration. That is the truth that German officers carried with them after the war. Not that they had won a battle, but that they had been granted time they should never have received. And that time, bought with nothing but American logistics failures, allowed them to build the defenses that made the final months of the war a grinding horror instead of a swift conclusion. The miracle in the West was no miracle. It was a tragedy, and its weight is carried still by the families who never got their soldiers back.